who has lived in the Chapel Hill area for many decades. If you get a chance to see Solomon act, please do so. He is amazing. Although I got the chance to see him grace the stage in Asheville, I'm still looking forward to attending one of the Mystery Dinner Theater shows he is involved in. As many of you already also know, Mr. Gibson gave a talk before Roe v. Wade was overturned that outlined many reasons why it shouldn't be. However, he was using reason, which I'm afraid is in short supply these days. So now he will speak to us about recovering women's fundamental right to choose. Please welcome Solomon Gibson III.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and Happy New Year. Welcome to 2024. As Mara pointed out, a couple years ago, I did a presentation on this subject before the Dobbs decision and laid out several reasons why I felt the court wouldn't overturn Roe, that they would want to avoid some of the predictable responses and backlash to any such decision. Well, the conservative faction of the court decided they didn't want to avoid any of that chaos. And so every one of those things that was foreseeable then have happened now. My feeling was that given since then all the horror stories that we've heard and the coming election and the influence that the abortion issue will have on the coming elections, it was time to update that presentation and make it a little more focused and concise. Now, what I'm going to be presenting here would be a strategy that no one is talking about. Because apparently, I'm the only one who has thought of it. That is true. It's a weirder world than I ever thought it was. But what I want to say is that this strategy, it doesn't matter your religious background. It's not about morality. My opinion, your opinion, no one's opinion really matters. And certainly our feelings should be irrelevant. So to begin with this, we'll start with a basic premise. And that is that the institution, the single institution that is the greatest threat to people's rights is state government. That has always been the case. And there are many examples of just that kind of thing. Now, starting with this premise, once this presentation is over, there are 5 things I hope you will remember and take with you. And the reason for that is because these 5 things will be somewhat useful in any conversation you may wish to have about this or in contacting your representative. Now, in no particular order. Number 1, we have reproductive rights exist under current law. And you'll find this under the 14th Amendment under the Equal Protection and Anti-Discrimination Clauses. And I'll be explaining how this works a little bit later. 2, under constitutional law, states cannot make people. Despite what state leadership says about turning the fetus into a person at the moment of conception, the state cannot do that under constitutional law. They can't make people, they can't bestow constitutional rights. And there are several precedents that support this. A state's recognized interest in prenatal life is a legal fiction. It doesn't exist really anywhere except in Roe v. Wade. One of the reasons is that prenatal life is nowhere in the Constitution. It doesn't exist there. And so whatever is recognizing this particular interest in the state was crafted by the Supreme Court as a way to have states intervene in the abortion issue. It's the only way they could be there. It doesn't matter whether a fetus is legally a person or not. Under the law, the end result would be the same. A woman could have it extracted. And I will explain how that works also later on in the presentation. Finally, number 5, compromise on this issue is not really possible. As much as we like to think that it is, and as often as it has been tried and people are discussing it, it is not. The reason for this is that the anti-abortion faction cannot compromise. They will always be looking for a way to ban the procedure and access to that procedure. They have to by their very definition and their very beliefs. And so if you have one side that cannot compromise, what does the other side, the pro-choice side, have left? You either have to give in, give up the fight, or you have to go for all the marbles. Those are your only choices. So in light of that, we're going to start with, I'm going to do a quick overview of the current strategies that are out there that apparently people are fighting for and believe have the most, the greatest possibility of reaching fruition. There's been a lot of talk over the last couple of years about federal laws and policies, that the federal government, Congress, is going to pass a federal law that will codify Roe into national law. Now, currently, this is undefined, and these proposals are pretty much compromises. State constitutional amendments are floating about, and they are proving to be quite successful. This is an example of one of the constitutional amendments that is making its way to various states throughout the country. State constitutional amendment states that every individual has a fundamental right to reproductive freedom, which entails the right to make and effectuate decisions about all matters relating to pregnancy, including, without limitation, prenatal care, childbirth, postpartum care, birth control, vasectomies, tubal ligation, abortion, abortion care, management of a miscarriage, and infertility care. And that seems to be quite comprehensive. I will get to some of the pros and cons of each one of these in just a moment. The Equal Rights Amendment, which has been around since 1923, is the most well-known and is a national strategy. The Equal Rights Amendment states, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And that's it, and that's pretty simple. Now, the pros and cons of each one of these are as follows. One, all to a varying degree will address the problem. So they all have that pro. Federal laws and policies also as a pro is a national strategy, and it would restore rights uniformly in every state. However, the cons involved with the federal law policy, one is compromise legislation. And as stated before, compromise is not really possible. There will always be a fight in the legislature to continue to diminish access to abortion procedures. As we are finding throughout the arguments, even now, the 50 years of Roe, which was a compromise, is gone, did not serve. There are discussions now about a 20-week ban, a 15-week ban, and a 6-week ban. So no one can decide because ultimately one side wants it all. There's unlikely passage of any federal laws or policies in the current environment. As we all know, the faction of conservatives and progressives are split pretty close down the middle, and the way that our system is set up, it's difficult, even if you have the slightest majority, to get anything passed, and we have seen that happening time and time again over the last few years since the Dobbs decision. Congress cannot get its act together and pass any such legislation because the conservative faction will filibuster it in the Senate at the very least. Federal law will maintain state intervention, which, as stated before, is one of the greatest threats to people's rights. As long as states are allowed to intervene, they will continue to try to place limits. And so as a matter of rights, you will always be subject to whichever faction is leading the state. And honestly speaking, that means that it's not really a right, it is a permission. For the ERA, the pros are there's a belief by some that it has already been ratified and just needs certification. The original deadline date, the ERA has been around since 1923 and has never gained passage officially. Around the 1970s, it came to the forefront thanks to the abortion issue and was given a 1979 deadline originally, which it did not attain. So the deadline by Congress was extended another 3 years. And it fell about 3 states short of that deadline. It wouldn't get the 38th state ratified until 2020. And what the idea being is that the pro-choice faction believes that it should be a part of the Constitution. The constitutional amendment of the ERA should officially be there. They're trying to push for certification. But to do that, they have to officially get the original deadline eliminated. And there are some parties working on that. The thing is that one of the effects, and I've moved into the cons, but let me go back a moment to the pros. The second pro to the ERA is that it has longevity. Once it's a constitutional amendment, it's there until Congress may move to try to eliminate it. The cons, as I was getting ready to state, is that the ERA is caught up in a legal quagmire. The fact is that since it wasn't ratified by 1982, the argument by the pro-choice side that you should ignore the deadline, ignore the 5 states that want to rescind their ratification, including the one that put a deadline on that ratification, I doubt would pass the current Supreme Court's muster, because that's what would happen. Even if they got it certified and placed in there, it would be challenged by any of a number of the conservative states, run through the court system, wind up in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court would say, well, it passed the deadline, or we're not going to, and we're going to allow the states that don't want it to rescind their ratification. Any of a number of ways that it could wind up. And so the ERA would wind up in the court system for who knows how many years. The ERA, in reading what it actually says, it's unclear the effects on state intervention. While it does equalize men and women formally, it makes no statement about exactly what that means, especially as far as the abortion issue is concerned. It's not there. It would serve as a kind of foundation for making an argument that women should be allowed access to this kind of medical care because men are, but it's still a little unclear as to how that would be interpreted by the courts. And given number 3, rights amendments have often been worked around. Every single one of them actually has been worked around. It is not hard to imagine that given a potential opportunity, the ERA on this particular issue would be worked around as well. The amendments to state constitutions, the pros to that are the ease of voter involvement. They're getting passed fairly easily because they're quite popular. All you need is a majority. You get them on the ballot, and then a majority makes a decision, and there they are. And of all the things that are on this list, that's one of the easiest things to do, and they're seeing quite a bit of success. Every state that manages to get it on the ballot, it does pass. Now, the cons to this is that it's non-national. What it means is that rights are now doled out on a state-by-state basis. Here you have the right, there you don't. Slavery was a states' rights issue. People's rights should not be up to individual states to say whether or not you have them. That's pretty much what we all believe. And this too, it is unclear what effect that it would have on state intervention. To have a right does not necessarily mean access to it. And so those are the pros and cons to those 3 strategies that are currently working their way throughout and are the popular strategies for this issue. Now I'm going to move on to the strategy that I'm proposing that no one is talking about. And there we have the Restoring Reproductive Rights flowchart. I made it myself. based on over the years what I managed to figure out, and it got kind of convoluted in explaining it. So I finally, over a period of time, had to say, I've got to make this more concise so that hopefully it would make it easier for people to follow it and understand it. And then this was a visual way of doing that. And so this is it. This is what came out of that. And it begins with a constitutional challenge, a constitutional question. And that is, do states have the constitutional ability to deny access of safe, approved treatment for a group's unique medical condition? For example, do states have the constitutional right, the ability to deny men having access to vasectomies, prostate surgery? Do other procedures, including pediatric care, certain pediatric procedures, geriatric procedures, circumcision? Can the states involve themselves and say that despite the fact that that procedure is safe and your doctor approves it, we can stop you from accessing it? Now, if the answer to that question is yes, the follow-up question is, can the states practice discrimination in using this ability? Are they able to pick any individual group and say, you can't have medical care that serves you, but I'm not going to do that to anybody else? Now, if the states do not have that power, then what we have is a violation of the 14th Amendment. If the states do have the power to discriminate in that fashion, then they are able to directly determine life and death for any favored or disfavored group of people. They can say that Black people who are, subject to sickle cell cannot access that treatment. They can say that transgender or gender-affirming medication can be denied. The states get to directly decide who has access to all the medical needs that they have, and others do not. If that is the case, then what we have is a way of selling the populace on the need for a more expansive equal rights amendment. Because if the states have that power to make such discriminatory actions, then every man, woman, and child is subject to that kind of jeopardy. And that's something that can be sold. And given how close the standard ERA has come to passage, it doesn't seem unreasonable that you could cobble together 3 additional states along with the 30, 32, 35 others and get a passage of an equal rights amendment. And with that passage, abortion rights are restored. Now, going back to the original question, do states have the constitutional ability to deny access to safe, approved treatment for a group's medical condition? If the answer to that question is no, then under current law, states cannot deny access to abortion procedures for any reason beyond patient safety, because pregnancy under the law is a medical condition. It's in current law. It's right there. And if that's the case, then rights are restored. It would be just that simple. However, if the states defy that legal determination, which in a way they are doing, then that would be a violation of the 14th Amendment, which is the same answer that we had previously. If the states cannot discriminate, it's a violation of the 14th Amendment. What would happen after that is that there would be a court challenge to this violation under the equal protection and anti-discrimination clauses of a specific group of people. In this particular case, women, because the states are not doing this to anyone else. And by definition, that is discrimination. You are targeting a single group of people and denying them a certain right or access to something that everyone else has. Now, given that legal challenge. The only defense in this specific case would be the states saying what the Roe court gave them originally, and has been reiterated in a recent case by the current court. The state has a recognized interest in prenatal life, which, as I said earlier, is a legal fiction. For a couple reasons. One, you could challenge the designation of prenatal as having no recognition in the Constitution. As I said before, it just isn't there. It doesn't exist. There's also a challenge to the designation of interest as being vague and broad. It doesn't say anything. Without the original Roe v. Wade gave us the trimester guidelines, which applied what that interest was and the limitations on it. The current court threw that out. Consequently, interest has no real meaning because it is ill-defined. Is it a casual, oh yes, she's pregnant, well, carry on, or can the state become egregiously involved in every stage of a woman's pregnancy? And we're seeing all of that happening right now. These two challenges could lead and can directly lead to the constitutional question of, is the fetus a person with constitutional rights? Once you've challenged the prenatal life, then you must establish what that prenatal life is under constitutional law. If the answer to that question is yes, as many want to pretend that it is, and that the fetal person has all the rights that everyone else has under the Constitution, what it means is that that fetal person also has all the limitations to those rights that every other person has. The most important being that one person's right ends where another's begin, no matter what the need. It doesn't matter how much I may need what you have. Even to save my own life, I'm not entitled to it if you don't choose to give it to me. I need your blood, I can't get it without your permission. They can't even test you to see if we have the same blood type without your permission. It just doesn't matter. Under constitutional law, your body is your body, and nobody is entitled to use, no person is entitled to use it. And so under that constitutional edict, and there's plenty of precedent for that, the fetal person can be removed on request to prevent continued violation of both a woman's rights and the 13th Amendment. Because if it is a person and the state insists that you carry it to term, what they have said is that that person is allowed to use your body for its own benefit against your will, which of course is the very definition of slavery. And since that is a clear violation, rights are restored. Now, going back to the question of whether or not the fetus is a person with constitutional rights, if the answer is no, then the pregnancy is legally a medical condition, and the patient is allowed to access safe, approved treatment for that condition under their doctor's advice or care, whatever their decision. And as such, rights are restored. Now, under this strategy, there seems to be no way around it. Under current constitutional law, as we believe it to be, as we've told it to be, under these scenarios, no matter which one they are, the rights for reproductive access is restored. The only thing that is not happening is this very challenge. And so I don't know necessarily why this isn't being talked about. As I said, it seems to be because, well, I'm apparently the only one that thought it up. I'm not exactly sure why that is. But to go back to the beginning, because that's been so concise, the 5 things I do want you to remember from what I presented here is that reproductive rights does exist under current law. And as I've shown you, under the 14th Amendment's equal protection and anti-discrimination clauses, a woman is allowed to exercise her right to access safe, approved medical care for her medical condition, just like all of us are. If she is not, then that can't be anything but discriminatory. And that means women are not given equal protection under our current laws. Under constitutional law, states cannot make people. Now, that wasn't in this, but there is precedent for that. And you'll find that precedent in the most interesting of places. And that's the 3/5 compromise, interestingly enough. The 3/5 compromise didn't allow the Southern states to designate their slaves as people unilaterally, as they wanted to do to gain greater power in Congress for representation. And they acquiesced to that 3/5 compromise. They de facto agreed that states could not unilaterally turn what is not recognized as a person into a person for their own benefit. This, of course, was flipped after the Civil War for the Reconstruction Amendments. And once again, the states acquiesced to that. Southern states said that now Black people were indeed people because the Constitution and the Congress says so. So it is agreed that states cannot make people just willy-nilly. Can't do it. No, but they didn't have to, but they did it. By their very actions, they acquiesced. And separate but equal was different. It did not deny people. The Southern states did not deny that Black people weren't people. They created, through their own cleverness, ways of working around the 15th Amendment. They didn't say Black people couldn't vote because they weren't people and we don't recognize that. They said, we're just going to make it more difficult for these people to be able to vote. And that's the way it's been. States recognizing interest in prenatal life, well, I've gone through that. It doesn't matter whether the fetus is legally a person or not. Just did that because under the laws, it really doesn't. The courts and the states have been getting away with not defining what a fetus is legally. That's how they've been getting away with this in a lot of ways. It is understood, if you asked, that a fetus is not a person under the law and has never been designated as such. They just haven't taken it that next step. They have decided to equate legal protections with constitutional rights because most people don't make the distinction. But the reality is that the legal protections that a state apply do not supersede constitutional rights. So whatever the state does to protect the fetus doesn't really say that a woman loses her rights to privacy in her own body because the state has said this entity has protections. But no one challenges it. And once again, compromise is not really possible. And we've seen that time and time and time and time again. We see it right now. And all of this comes under the aegis of states exercising powers that they're pretending that they have, but really don't. States throughout history have been the greatest threat to people's rights because of the nature of states' rights that this country has developed. If you look at all those denial of rights, you will generally find them at the state level. It's not the federal government that's the threat. If a group of people or people are having problems with the federal government, then they need to look at the state and their representation because that's where the problem is. Whether we're talking voting rights for women, which women had state by state, on some states and not others. Slavery, of course, depends on which states you were in. And this is true straight on down the line. Reconstruction, voting rights, state by state, wherever you wanted to have those tests, literacy tests, poll taxes. That was a state by state issue. And even now they're arguing how voting is handled on a state by state basis. Right now, the abortion issue, whether or not women have access, depends on which state you're in, not the federal government. And so my hope is that this strategy finds some purchase somewhere. The only thing I can do with it is put it out there. I have no specific legal skin in the game. And so I can't be the party to anything. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a woman. My ability to do anything with this stops at presentations because, well, I'm not a lawyer or a woman. And so I like to say, in effect, that I've written a really good song, but I can't perform it. It has to be done by those musicians and people out there with those skills to do something with it. And so I'd like to thank you all for your attention. I hope you have many questions because I'd love to answer them. Why are you insecure?
I am insecure. So we will have a question answer period, and we're going to pass a mic around for that because we have a Zoom audience and we want everybody to be able to hear. But before we start with questions and answers, I'd like to say that our society is an all volunteer organization. We receive no money from any organization. We survive due to your commitment to our common goals. So we pass the basket, and thank you in advance for any donations you'd like to make. That said, some ground rules for Q&A. Please raise your hand, wait for the microphone, ask one question at a time if you would, and keep it reasonably short if you can, and then give everybody a chance before, if you have a second question, we'll go around again and try to get to everybody. So who has the talking stick? We'll pass the mic around, and Solomon, I'll give the podium back to you.
Oh, Laura's right there. Hi, Solomon. Thank you so much. That was very, very impressive. And I'm curious where you did all your research. I mean, I don't know if you have a political leaning or a lawyer, a legal interest, but it must have been a lot of work.
It didn't necessarily feel like it because of the way I tend to work, which is rather undisciplined, unfortunately. But much of what I do is in my head. Over the years, because I think one of the greatest benefits I have in my life is that I know a lot of smart people, and I like to talk to them, as anyone in this room knows. And so over time, I acquire information from various people and various entities, and my head synthesizes it, and logic is a real basis for, and reason is a real basis for whatever I tend to think about, finding a logical or reasonable reason for just about anything. And over a period of time, the information just started to hit like a sort of brainstorm, I guess. And once that starts, it becomes a matter of finding what supports it, where the information can come from that kind of justifies and supports that reasoning.
And have you researched who you should contact to further your idea?
Yes. There have been many people, like I said, I talk to smart people all the time. And smart people always have opinions and thoughts about many things. And so there are some people I go specifically for information like this. And also books and the internet, and others for ancillary information that kind of stands just slightly outside that I can find some commonality with.
Solomon, I have a actually application. I can see the Equal Rights Amendment across like pay structures and access to medical care and things like that. But how do you expand the equal rights to an issue where it only affects one part of the population, but not the entire population? Where is the equality? How are you defining equality?
I looked at one central thing, actually, that we all kind of know, but they've always kind of danced around throughout the history since they crafted the Constitution. And that the Constitution never stipulates any specific group of people. There's nothing in the Constitution that says white males get these rights and Black males get these rights and white women get these rights, or any group. It's not there. What the Constitution says most clearly and repeatedly is people. And that's what initially led me to beginning this, is that the Constitution says that people have these rights. And if that is true, our job is to make our institutions reflect that, rather than the piecemeal that they have managed to get away with through interpretation all these years.
Fair enough.
I like how you put it towards the end there about the rights of the fetus in regards to the mother carrying the fetus. I always had a similar idea, but the way you put it is so much more accessible, because I always thought, well, a fetus is a parasite on the mother's body, and trying to get that argument through to people who say, oh, it's just a baby, would never work. The way you put it was so much more acceptable.
Did you raise your hand, Fred, or did you?
So I liked your argument, but I'd like to play devil's advocate if I can.
Sure.
Particularly the part about the fetus's right. If you assume the fetus is a person, so fetus personhood exists. If that turns out to be the legal way that things would go, you could think of that person as in a way of dangling from a rope off a cliff. All right, I'm holding the rope, and a person is dangling, and if I let the rope go, the person's going to die. Does that make me a murderer? And so you could think of the fetus being somewhat like that, as wholly dependent upon life hanging by a thread, if you will. The mother, if the mother lets the rope go, could she then be prosecuted as a murderer? And how do you get around that argument?
Actually, it's pretty simple.
Okay.
One, your analogy is quite apt. But even if it were, the other argument I would make is that holding onto that rope and pulling that person up is different. One, it does not interfere with your personal rights. You are not required to actually give up anything to pull that person up along the rope. Now, if someone held a gun to your head and said, don't you let that rope go. It might be a different argument. But the idea is that in your analogy, there is no interference with the individual's rights. And the law itself speaks to that more than anything else. And that's what I would always kind of fall back on. In all of the discussions that go on about this issue and the questions that are asked by conservatives, what about this? What about that? The simplest argument that I would always fall back on is, this is what the law says. And if the law applies equally to all of us, then I shouldn't be required to give up any of my rights for another person. You can't make me, because the law says you can't make me.
Solomon, I thought that was really very interesting. And one of the things I really liked about it, so I have a comment and a question. My comment is, we used to use those sorts of flow charts in at work and call them decision trees. And they could take these really complex issues and sort of boil it down to facts. Strips out the emotion. You know, how do you feel about this? It's not how you feel. It's yes or no. And eventually it brings you to a place. And so I really liked the way you use that. Actually, I have another comment. Am I allowed another comment? I disagree that compromise is not possible. I think compromise is possible. I think we had compromise with Roe versus Wade, and then followed up a little bit with the Pennsylvania case that sort of, it's because we are now dealing with zealots who don't believe in compromise that we're in the situation we're in. And I think most people would agree that the viability standard was pretty reasonable, with exceptions, you know, for severe fetal abnormalities or mother's health. I think that compromise made lots of sense. And it's just that we have zealots who will no longer allow a standard that may deviate from what they want.
That's exactly the point, though. I don't disagree that the compromise could have worked. And, you know, it does. One could have the question as to whether or not one should be allowed to compromise individuals' rights. Yeah, for example, are you a slave half a year and not the other half? Should they have made that compromise? And if that's the case, do you really have that right? Now, that may be another argument, but it is one of the arguments as far as compromising on people's rights goes. But what you pointed out is exactly what I've said at the beginning, is you can't compromise, not because compromise isn't technically a thing you can do. It's that there's a side that will not let you do it. That's why it's not possible. The zealots you talk about are the ones that got power. They're the ones that got into office. They're the ones that have been pushing this. They're the ones that have been creating egregious restrictions on access, even in their own states. And what do you do against a faction like that if they're able to acquire the halls, get into the halls of power? My position is there's nothing you could do about that except to do what they've done, depending on if you believe it's right or not. And the thing is that you actually, those that are fighting for the rights of women actually have the law on their side. Also, the idea of a compromise is a bit insulting to women, because it presumes that women can't make that compromise within themselves. That there are women out there willy-nilly deciding after viability, well, I'm getting rid of this thing because you know what, it's just, you know, a little too tough. I'm putting on weight or blah, blah, blah. Women are not making that decision. And so a compromise implies a falsity. And that's also one of the things I'm against. If we truly believe in equality of all people, and we believe in the rights of all people, I'm not going to assume that women are more irresponsible with life than men are, because they absolutely are not. I mean, we have guns, we have war, men are always killing people. And yet somehow we can't ban any guns. We're certainly not arguing. I mean, the world is, we know what's going on in the world. And so my feeling tends to be is that, compromise, whether possible or not, also is not fair. It is never going to be actually fair, as long as you keep saying that women are going to do something horrible and we're afraid from them and we've got to stop them just in case that something might happen.
I guess technology.
But that would be my response to compromise and what I meant by saying that.
Solomon, the original Roe versus Wade ruling did not, the original Roe versus Wade ruling did not establish any sort of absolute right to abortion. It divided the pregnancy into 3 trimesters. And did not they rule that in the 3rd trimester that the state did have some serious interest in a viable pregnancy?
They did. I'm not sure how necessarily to respond to that, but or what the question is. I mean, absolutely, trimester guidelines had an escalating amount of state involvement, to the point by the 3rd trimester, they could pretty much say you can't do it, which was usually around 27 weeks, which was beyond viability, at least at that time. And that's why it was decided. The court looked at what doctors were saying and said, okay, we're going to decide on viability. And this is what they're saying. So we're going to do that because it seems reasonable. And yeah, it seems reasonable. And so, yeah, that's what they did. I thought it was, for all the reasons I said earlier, kind of flawed reasoning, because women aren't waiting that long to terminate a pregnancy.
Is this working? Oh, it's on, right?
It is on.
I didn't know if there's an on-off button. I just wanted to respond quickly to something Dorothy said. First of all, thank you for the presentation. I love the way you think way out of the box and it all comes together. Really nice to hear a different way of thinking and addressing these things. And my response to the compromise that we have seen actually relates right back to what you were saying, because who decides, maybe in the 3rd trimester, who gets to decide what reasons you could choose to abort the fetus or not? And what happens is the workaround. Sure, there's the compromise in place, but it depends on the state's powers and decision-making, what that interpretation really means of those things. And that's where they've been working around and did for such a long time, And so in that case, compromise can't work if it's states' rights determining and everybody's individual interpretation depending upon who's in power. And so it gets back to what you originally said, you don't get rights depending upon who's in power in your state, and they can be taken away or given back whenever politically the regime changes. And I believe that was one of your points that I absolutely agree with it. It isn't acceptable and it isn't legal. I say that being not an attorney at all.
Well, it was always my belief in stumbling upon these. It was always my belief when I stumbled upon this, is that one of the worst things that Roe v. Wade said in it was states recognize interest in prenatal life. That if there is ever a compromise, if one could say that a part of that compromise should be the elimination of state intervention. That the states cannot have any determination in this issue whatsoever. That became a part of the compromise. Yeah, you eliminate a lot of the problems with access.
I'm actually going to talk briefly about compromise also, The other reason that compromise makes me nervous is because some of the same people who are incredible zealots about no abortion under any circumstance are the ones who are also making muttering noises about no birth control. And I'm really not sure I want to compromise with somebody who's going to potentially go that next step also and try to push it. I don't think they can get anywhere with that. But 10 years ago, I would never have thought Roe v. Wade would have been overturned either.
Well, my experience as an individual of color in this country of ours is that nothing is off the table because everything has been done. I do find myself surprised by a lot of things. Conservatives have surprised me at least 3 separate times. I've underestimated, their desire to do something. The latest being the current Supreme Court. I mean, a couple of years ago, I wouldn't have believed that they would have wanted to cause the chaos that they have. There were easier ways to do it. But here we are. I underestimated them. Or overestimated them.
Thank you. This was really good. I think my focus is kind of where my strength is, which comes to patient privacy and patient protections. And I guess it's more of a comment in getting your feedback. It's just how federal protections of privacy have not superseded all of this, right? We're discussing a person who is carrying a child and talking to their physician. I'm always surprised at how it seems like the privacy, the HIPAA, with this for short, the Privacy Protection and Portability Act and all that came about with HIV, right? We were trying to protect HIV patients from having all their information sent out to the world, and they got this protection for all of us through this act. And so it's always interesting to me to see how this is not something that is just an easy, it's a patient, their privacy, keep it moving. The other part of it is the protection of our practitioners. If a physician tells you you have cancer and you need treatment, nobody is going to go back and say, oh, well, except for these people. But if you're telling your physician that I can't keep this child because I have too many, or this child is sick, or this child is going to kill me if I have it, no one then should go back and question what this provider has told you. So I feel like those two things, protection of privacy, protection of professional guidance. If your lawyer tells you something, you do it, and that lawyer is protected from whatever they tell you, even if they know you're guilty, right? It's just, a thought that kind of ran through my head when you were going through your presentation of, why do we have to go this deep when we already have these protections for privacy between patients, and we send folks to medical school for a very long time to give their medical professional opinion on what we should do with ourselves, and that should still be protected. So just your thoughts on that.
Well, I agree. And I particularly agree with the point of how deep we seem to have to go for this issue. The very nature of my strategy is that it already exists. It's already there. We don't need an ERA or federal laws or all this dancing that has to be done because the law already stipulates it. The only thing we have to go to is that the Constitution says people. Doesn't say men, doesn't say women, doesn't say any of that stuff. And that the 14th Amendment says we're all protected equally. It seems to me that's just that obvious and just that simple. But we've always had to do this dance because of the way it all started. And so, we're stuck with this, kind of. What I've discovered in crafting this strategy, it's starting to sound pompous now, is the notion is that it changes in some ways the way we would have to interpret the Constitution and how it's been interpreted throughout the years. Throughout the years, the courts and entities have doled out constitutional rights piecemeal to whatever group hasn't had them, and just those rights that are asked about at the time. The Constitution doesn't say that, but they've managed to get away with doing it, and they continue to get away with doing that. what I have presented here kind of forces, it elevates the interpretation of people by associating an isolated group as that majority, that women are people. And it becomes a template for any group that wants to carry on its rights by simply saying, hey, we're people. But we get everything that all those white guys got. And so, but they've managed to do that dance for years and years and years and years, and no one has been able to challenge them on it. I would maintain that it's interesting that this issue, what's going on right now with this very issue, is one of the ways to enter that field of getting that reinterpretation. I don't think any other issue comes as close to being able to turn things around as far as constitutional interpretation goes as this issue does. As I said, I'm not sure. Well, no, I'll mention that later, a little bit later.
Solomon, not being here when the Roe versus Wade decision was passed, not realized that there was a caveat of the third trimester. Sorry, trimester.
Yes.
Trimester. And you said that it was because that time the medical profession deemed it so, that third trimester. But that is 60 years. So now the medical profession can sustain a fetus a lot earlier. Isn't that a problem? That if you have a caveats like that, you will always run up against it.
It was adjusted, and I don't know the year of Casey because I didn't delve too much into the Casey decision, which was also overturned because of this. Casey decision altered the viability status actually for just that reason, and leaned more conservative, and decided that viability was at that time, and it was probably, I guess, the 90s or something like that. Viability at that time was 24 weeks, which is why we hear more about 24 weeks than 27 weeks. You barely hear 27 weeks anymore. And so there has been an alteration. That, of course, has been eliminated now with Dobbs.
It seems to me another slippery slope in this is that we are saying that the abortion is what we choose to prosecute when we end a pregnancy. And, you know, how do you deal with people who through ignorance or willful neglect want to end a pregnancy and do things? And I think legally it's a problem to distinguish between someone who goes into a hospital and has a procedure or someone who takes such bad care of themselves that they, in essence, create an abortion. And I don't blame them for it for desperation, but I think legally that's a problem.
I guess the answer I would have, you're talking about irresponsibility. And my answer to that would be, we allow people to do irresponsible and dangerous things all the time. You know, we have gun shootings. Number one killer of children these days are handguns. And yet we allow people to run around willy-nilly, no matter how crazy they may be, to pack a weapon. And there's certainly more of those than the irresponsible woman out there that's going to, I don't know, do whatever it is and manage to get done what she wants to get done. And so once again, it becomes a matter of law and equality for me. If we're going to allow people to run around and eat egregiously until they, or drink until they die, or, you know, pack weaponry until whatever it is they decide to do with it, then the abortion issue is not the place to be putting your foot down if you're going to be consistent about the sanctity of life. And so once again, I would argue that we shouldn't be judging women any more harshly than we judge anyone else. I do have one more thing. Because I was waiting to see if anyone would ask this question, but I'm always kind of surprised that no one asked the question as to why no one is talking about this, why you never hear about it. They're talking about the abortion issue, but this strategy hasn't made it anywhere in the zeitgeist. The other three have. And the other three have their issues, and everyone knows that. But this one does not have any of those issues. To implement it, all it would take is a civil rights attorney and one woman, maybe a civil rights attorney in this team if you want to go through all that, but a civil rights attorney and one woman going to a court and saying, we want to challenge the state's ability to deny this woman access to safe, approved medical care for her particular need. We feel that is unconstitutional. The Texas case with those 5 women was not this issue. What it was.
Let's carry on after the session.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone.
Hey, outstanding talk. So we're gonna have to be out of the room by 3:30 today, so I'm pushing things along just a tad. But I will move now for announcements. Does anybody have any announcements?
Oh,
So as always, the Change for Change, this quarter, we're supporting the North Carolina Community Bail Fund of Durham. What we do, their website is very simple. We post low bail for people who would otherwise not afford it, return clients to their home, job, and communities, and give them a more equitable case. And upon a court appearance or case resolution, the bail is returned to the fund to help others in need. So I think they may have spoken to us a while back as well. So good organization to support, and please drop your change in the jar. Thank you.
All right, Laura.
just a quick reminder to everybody, do not come here next Sunday. We will not be here. It is Zoom only. Chris will be running the show next Sunday. As everybody knows, we're getting ready for MLK Day. And probably most people are like me and have seen Martin Luther King's speech, I have a dream. Da, 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 da. It's not the only speech he did, shockingly enough. So we're going to get to watch a different Martin Luther King speech and see a little bit different aspect of things, and then have discussion afterwards. Next Sunday, Zoom only. And then 2 Sundays from now, we'll be right back here, same bat place, same bat channel.
Dorothy.
In Chris's absence,